Recently I've been getting into the history of World Expositions. These massive events attract millions of attendees from around the world, and though only running for 3 to 6 months, have a lasting effect on the city that hosts it. For the city, it's a chance to redevelop an undesirable area for the better. It's a chance to bring in those juicy tourism dollars and boost the economy. For me though, I'm mostly fascinated by the relics left behind and the things that don't get left behind. It's honestly pretty crazy just how much goes into what is such a short-lived event. I thought it'd be a fun challenge to host one in Sunset City, see just how well my city can handle such a huge volume of people. Where would I even build such an event? And most challenging, how would I create an authentic World Exposition? Because at the heart of these things, World Expositions, they're designed to showcase the achievement of nations. They're also a great opportunity for local businesses to promote new and exciting products, to leap into the marketplace. But then for some, it's an ambitious and expensive gamble that may or may not pay off. Good luck, champ. To simulate this epic event, I'm using 7 event spawners and a whole load of these boom park generators hidden within the grounds of the expo. These block service events act like campus stadiums and are set for an event each month, simulating 7 months the expo will run for. Kinda. With the first one starting on the 30th of April, let's make that the deadline for the grand opening. That means I've only got a few months to prep the land, build the expo, and get the city ready with public transport and infrastructure. Now of course, all of which are super expensive, so our expo is going to have to act like an overpowered amusement park, generating enough cash to cover all of our bases. But without further ado, guys, welcome to Expo 1983. It's not built yet, you silly duffers. We're gonna build the thing. At the moment, it's just a big old seedy industrial site. I actually purposely built this area with the intention of redeveloping it into a World Expo, because so many of these World Expos were built on old industrial sites, because so many of these areas are actually built really close to the downtown, in the heart of the city, but then as industry gets pushed out of the city, there's so many of these open, great big spaces. And what a great opportunity for the city to redevelop an area like this, but then also host an epic event. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing. I also wanted to use a little bit of the pre-existing infrastructure down here, just as a way of saving a bit of the cost, but then also just a bit of a nod to our old industrial past of this area. But before we did that, we needed to bring back a good old building that I deleted a few months ago. I built it and then I deleted it straight away. Fabarina, it's back. Yay, Fabarina's back. Well, I actually exported it using Move It before I deleted it, because this whole area, this whole reason why we're building an expo is because a whole bunch of people got in touch saying that perhaps the arena was built as part of a World Expo that was once in Sunset City. I love that idea so much that I thought, well, you know what? Let's actually just build a World Expo. Let's just do that. So if you're someone who got in touch about a World Expo, yeah, that's the whole reason why I'm building this in the first place. I didn't even cross my mind until people got in touch. So thank you very much for that. I used Move It to restore the exact position of the old arena, and then I just had to connect up a couple of the nodes that were no longer connected and just get the area looking a little bit nicer. But I am calling it the old arena because at the moment it is not called Fab Arena. It is just a building as part of the exposition, and down the track, yeah, then it'll turn into Fab Arena. I deleted the parking lot to make way for the grand entrance. I wanted to reuse a lot of these roads that were already here as part of the industrial zone and turn them into pedestrian pathways as part of the exposition. I also feel like it's just the perfect way to cut on some costs, really just reuse a lot of the old infrastructure. And speaking of which, we have this old factory here. It would be nice to keep some part of it. Well, I figured that the factory itself was pretty run down, but the chimney, the smokestack, could be just turned into maybe a bit of a feature. So I decided to keep it. Obviously, it's not the whole thing or the real thing. It's just a chimney in place. But I'm gonna be honest, I don't end up keeping it as much as I love it. I think if Sunset City was based in more present day, then yeah, I think keeping a smokestack or even that warehouse or even more of the old industry and just repurposing it or even just turning it into more of a feature of this area, then yeah, I think that's more of a thing that you see maybe more present day. But I think that something like a smokestack or a really old factory, quite like that was, it will probably just be knocked down in the 80s to make way for something brand new as a new park that'll be in this area, or even just some showrooms. As you'll see that this will end up being replaced. There's a pretty big building that takes that exact spot of that smokestack. But I could be wrong. I know there's definitely examples of buildings that were heritage listed in the 80s. I can even think of the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney that was a power station and then repurposed into a museum. But that has become a bit of a focal point for Sydney in that area in Ultimo, whereas this smokestack actually kind of takes away from some of the focal points of the expo. So you'll see a little later on, maybe a little bit more of a justification for removing that smokestack. But for now it's there, it's a very prominent feature, and I wish I could have included it somehow. Maybe you guys can think about a way of including it down the track, but for now, it's there, but don't get used to it. Speaking of don't get used to it, don't get too used to the things that I'm placing down right now, because this is all very temporary. This is all just experimenting, trying to figure out what this place is going to look like. Expositions, they have a real particular look and feel to them, especially in the 80s, and there were 3 of which I was looking at the most for inspiration. Actually, now's a good time. Let's talk about them. Starting with the 1982 World's Fair held in Knoxville, this was a pretty iconic World's Fair that was held pretty dead center of Knoxville. I mean, you can't get much closer to the downtown than this. The Sun Sphere is about as iconic as it gets when it comes to the relics of an old expo, especially when it comes to the 80s. A lot of the area now seems to be dedicated to parkland and recreational use. Pretty cool to imagine that before this it was actually a rail yard, so quite a lot of changes happened. But I love all the old relics. There's still so much of the old expo still here. You can't really say the same about the next place. Expo 1986 was another massive event, this time held in Vancouver, right on the waterfront here. Pretty similar to Sunset Cities, but this one was really spread out to kind of hug this whole Bay Area, which was pretty amazing. This event had tons of showrooms. There were quite a lot of different transportation options, which was really fun, including a monorail. We'll talk about that a little bit later. A couple of relics left behind, another big old sphere, which will have to do something pretty similar. But yeah, there's a lot of things to love about this event. I'm going to be taking lots of inspiration from this one. But the next one, look, this one is a little bit more closer to home because it is in my home. Well, not really. It wasn't held in my home, but it was held in Australia. Expo 1988, held in Brisbane. The first time I learnt about this expo was probably about 10 years ago. I parked my car underneath this observation tower in Brisbane and I was really confused. What was this thing? It was really out of place, like lots of the old relics of these old expositions. It felt really strange. But as you can tell, they've all got a lot in common. They were all built on these old industrial sites. They've all got some sort of observation deck or some sort of sphere. They've all got showrooms. They've all got some sort of amusement park attached to them. That's kind of cool, isn't it? Maybe we'll do something like that as well. But in terms of buildings and architecture, they're all fairly similar. They've all got very quick pop-up stalls and showrooms that are only really meant to be there for the expo. But then you've also got a lot of tents and lots of awnings and lots of places for shade and shelter. But then there are a couple of places that are way more established. It's almost like the city builds it for the expo, but plan on keeping it. They're going to use it for something else down the track. And that's our arena, that's Fab Arena, we'll keep that. And there's a couple of other buildings we'll end up keeping as well. They'll get turned into something else. But in terms of everything else, they need to be showrooms, they need to look fast and quick and, just temporary buildings. As I was playing around with the positioning of these buildings, I was avoiding this train line. This came into our old industrial zone, but I wanted to use it somehow. My original plan was maybe we could make some sort of very temporary train station that went into the expo. But being so close to our central station, it didn't really feel like it was that necessary because people could just make the walk or even just catch other public transport to our expo. It just felt a little bit of overkill. But I just knew deep in my soul I couldn't get rid of it. We had to use it somehow. So I ended up messaging Besquigglehausen, he's my train go-to person, and he got in touch with an excellent idea. But that is a job for a little later in this episode. I'm just going to drag the node into this warehouse for now, just as a little bit of a teaser as to what is to come. But yeah, it's pretty exciting. Just you wait. With the train line now figured out, I had to get back to the buildings. I was really struggling with these buildings. I just could not find anything that was the perfect fit for our World Exposition. So I decided to put a pin on the larger structures and focus more on some of the awnings and sails that were going to provide a little bit more shelter for the people walking around. Unfortunately though, this was way harder. Sails and tents are a pretty stock standard thing when it comes to World Expositions. Unfortunately, in City Skylines, that's not really a thing. Even on the Steam Workshop, there's nothing really that close. In fact, this was the closest thing I could find, and I still had to use procedural objects to manipulate these shapes a little bit better. I'm scaling them up quite a lot, and then even combining them and just removing some of the different segments and different pieces. Oh man, I mean, it looks like I'm going through this pretty quickly, but this was an absolute pain. And we got there in the end, but I don't think the end product is anything to write home about. I think it's definitely leaves a lot to be desired, but that's fine. I think it is what it is, and I think it does a job, even though it is a little bit starfishy in areas and maybe could be providing slightly better shade for people, but it is what it is. I had better things and more interesting things to get to. I started to place them around the expo just to get a bit of a feel of where I can connect them and where they would sit, but at this point I was really struggling with how this was going to come together. I know it's pretty early days, but at this point I'd been working on it for quite some time and it just wasn't looking very expo-y. So I felt like I needed to make some big changes in some areas just to make things feel a little bit more interesting and a little bit different. So I decided to work on the main strip a little bit more. I felt like this area might be a little bit more permanent. It could be something that's kept for down the track, maybe even after the expo. I placed down a couple of these commercial buildings and then worked on this corner piece that's going to sit in this bit of an awkward spot. Decided to turn this into a procedural object just so I can manipulate some of the corners to turn this area into a little bit of a cafe. But it wasn't until I added in our observation deck that this place truly came alive. I couldn't build a World Expo without building one of these things, right? I felt like I had to. It was just a smidge too big for this area, so I decided to use procedural objects just to scale it down a little bit. I'm using procedural objects on the base of it just to scale the bottom of it a little bit more, but then the top of it I am scaling up a little bit more just so that the top looks a little bit bigger and then the actual shaft of it looks a little bit... Okay, I can't talk about this thing without it sounding phallic, so I'm just gonna stop describing it. The addition of this tower really makes a huge difference to the overall look of the expo, and we really changed it quite a lot using procedural objects. But it was time to make this place a little bit more functional by turning it into a pedestrian area and placing in a couple of different services. This was, of course, a very important step because I needed to make sure that all this was functional, being pedestrian streets. We needed to make this into a pedestrian area. But with that all figured out, I really needed to get back to figuring out what the showrooms and exhibition buildings were going to look like. And at this stage, I was feeling pretty happy with the buildings I had chosen. These were buildings, retail buildings from the UK. These are older assets on the Steam Workshop, but still look amazing. And they were perfect for showroom buildings because they did look a little bit more temporary. They weren't, they all had very similar architecture, so they sort of look like they were built by the same manufacturer. Actually, exactly like they were built by the same manufacturer. I have turned these into procedural objects because I am going to change the signage on them. At the moment, they look like all the same sign, but I'm going to be changing it so that they will be exhibition spaces for countries or for something else, which we'll talk about a little later on. But things were coming together a little bit better. As you can see, things were starting to just take shape a little bit more. So I figured it was time to figure out where some of the pathways are going to go, a little bit more of the detail work, but also not a huge amount of detail because that will come a little bit later on. Bit of concrete, a bit of bits and pieces, and then it was time to add in some trees. And I always say this, but trees really make such a huge difference when it comes to these builds. It just adds that bit of greenery that you really needed. It's always that icing on the cake that you didn't really know you needed until you start placing them down. And I'm probably going a little bit too much with trees because really this area would have been so demolished before it was built into an exposition. But you know what? I think that we needed something. And to be honest, a lot of these places do bring in a lot of trees just to fill some spaces like this. And with that, it was looking a little bit more complete, but there was one section that definitely wasn't. A lot of old industry sat over here, and I wasn't going to get to it in this episode. In fact, this will be the next episode. So I wanted to show that the expo is still under construction. Yeah, it's not going to be finished by the time we open it. There's going to be a few additions that we're going to need to do. So this is going to be, at some stage, a hotel. Yeah, as part of the new hotels DLC. So we'll just have to get back to that when we get to it. With the grand opening getting closer and closer, it was time to build the entry. I wanted it to be the same sort of style as Fab Arena. You know, this is an area that is all pretty much the entry point, but I wanted there to be a ticket booth so that we could actually charge people getting in. So something just super easy, pretty temporary, nothing too flash, but the trees and the, general feel of this area does feel quite nice. But like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, this was going to act like an overpowered amusement park, so I did need some sort of entry into our park. And I wanted it to be the entry, I didn't want to just place it somewhere else. But as you can see, the park entry didn't attach very well to this pedestrian pathway. I needed it to attach to a road. So I decided to delete our pedestrian street and instead place our entry points with these little park entries and then just attaching them with a pedestrian pathway. This works a lot better, means that we could detail it up slightly different to the rest of the streets around here, and I also really like it because it means that we won't see any actual cars driving through this entry. Instead, they will use the entry point, which is elsewhere. I really like that. Each World Exposition has some sort of universal theme that centers all the exhibitions around it. For instance, it could be the arts, it could be technology, it could be transport. Well, regarding that, somebody got in touch and mentioned that why don't we do our own version of NASA, as NASA is a bit of a thing in Florida. We're basing our city and state on Florida. Well, why don't we do FASE, Federal Administration of Space Exploration, and they are the sponsors of our exposition, and also the expo has a space theme, maybe about space exploration, or maybe it's just about the space race, or just a sci-fi theme in general, which I absolutely love. This has got to be one of my all-time favorite comments. I've got an area dedicated to a space center on the map that I do completely plan to build exactly that. So I love the fact that that's called FASE, and I love the fact that they are now sponsoring our exposition and the expo has a space theme. So I figured we better include some sort of monument that's going to sit as the grand entry into our expo, which is this absolutely perfect monument that I grabbed from the Steam Workshop. It couldn't be more perfect. I had to scale it down quite a lot. It was pretty big, but just a little bit of scaling using procedural objects works absolutely fantastically. Now, this is a great addition to the storyline, and I've got quite a lot more additions to the storyline. Because somebody did mention as well that we should include a whole bunch of flags dedicated to the countries that are showcased in our exposition. But I got an idea. Hear me out, I'm gonna need your input, but rather than having countries with exhibition spaces, what about we have cities that people have made in City Skylines? So there are a bunch of cities made by City Planner Plays. Clearwater County's on there, and Nicollet Bay, Sardis' city's on there, Jeremy Thunder's city's on there, Sicilia Republic, Teddy Radko, he's got a flag. There's a bunch of flags from YouTubers and other cities that have been made within the community. I just grabbed from the Steam Workshop. If you can see them, if you recognize them, let me know, because it'd be kind of cool to add something that's based on their city or maybe even their channel or whatever. It'd be kind of fun to make it so that rather than we've got countries with exhibition spaces, we have cities based on people in the community. So let me know, because I'm gonna need your input for what could be represented from those guys. So hit me up, but I think that's kind of like a fun little addition rather than having countries, even though it's kind of more like based around countries, it's kind of keeping it within our community, you know? A little bit of fun. We just had the detail work left to go, and then we can start opening our exposition, but I figured we needed to have some sort of fence to stop any bludgers from getting into our expo for free, and then it was time to start figuring out where our events were going to go. But I had this problem that, well, you can't actually place these on pedestrian streets. You could only place them on roads. Kind of annoying and a bit of an oversight. Luckily, I did have an invisible road, and that was easy enough just to drag from some of these pedestrian streets, and then I could easily place those events onto those roads, which was great. Actually worked out totally fine. So very lucky in that regard. I began to drag over the event spawners from this little beach that I had just as a bit of a holding spot and place them within the buildings that I wanted to host the events. I wanted to see people walking inside these places, and then started just to place down so many of these boom park generators. These things really attract a lot of people, and they also provide a bit of extra land value for this part of the city as well, which is excellent, which absolutely would be the case as well. And then with all that, it's grand opening time, baby. Let's hit play and see whether or not people are actually gonna use our park, because that's the whole thing. I wanted to see people entering through the park entrance, seeing if they're gonna pay the cash and seeing if this is even gonna work, because at this stage, I didn't really know if this was gonna work. So I was pretty bloody happy when I saw that one person walking through the gates. Yes. And then I noticed that there was a massive crowd already in there. I guess there was already an event that was going on and people were leaving that event. So yeah, it's open and people are in, but how well is this going to work? Were we going to see loads of people? Were they going to be paying for park entry? At this stage, I didn't really know. I let the simulation run for a little while just to see how many people were going to turn up. And of course, a lot of people turned up. This was very, very satisfying to see. But I knew that this was just the tip of the iceberg because the longer I let it sit, the longer people and the more people were actually going to turn up. So I figured I'd take this opportunity to detail up the expo a little bit while we waited for more people to show up. I thought that the main street could actually be dedicated to the local businesses of Sunset City. Starting with Fab Soda, who have an excellent exhibition space right on the main strip. I'm imagining that these guys are out the front promoting their new flavor that of course they've been searching for out in the swamplands of the Seminole State. Giving them a spot right next to the cafe, I reckon this is a spot we'd probably get a free little sample of that new flavor. I don't really know what that flavor is yet though. I'm sure it's a banger. I also wanted to place the television station CS1, that is our television station of Sunset City as well, giving them a couple of satellite dishes and the new logo out the front, and then the Sparks FM radio station. I'm sure DJ Yayo is somewhere inside doing some sort of live commentary based on the expo grand opening, of course. King Buns, can't forget about King Buns. Did you realize that I just placed down that sign and then immediately the crime notification came up? Interesting. Very interesting. And then something a little bit different, a little bit new, Sandbox Microsystems. What's all this about? A new sign? A new company? We'll talk about them a little later on, but that's here, they're here, get used to it. And then the last local business is Valdez. This is the petroleum company of the Seminole State. Pretty large showroom. I'd love to know what's inside here. There's something else I want to place down at some stage, but that's for another day. And then, not exactly a local business, but definitely a unique one. This is Strict Toaster Cafe. Strict Toaster was a YouTuber who made amazing City Skylines content. Pretty much one of the reasons why I started my channel in the first place. He doesn't post anymore, but just a little bit of a nod to Strict. Now, that train line. What on earth were we going to do with that train line? I know I was teasing about it before. What could we possibly do with it? Well, Beskriegelhausen suggested that rather than repurposing this as a way of transporting people, what about we use this as a space to showcase upcoming transportation networks that are going to be hitting up Sunset City at some stage? Well, pretty close, we're not too far away from this, but our metro line. This is going to be the metro train that's going to be operating within Sunset City, so this is a way for people to come in, have a sit on the train and, get to experience it, look at the map, and learn all about that new technology and just to learn all about what is a bit of infrastructure that is yet to come within the city. I think that is just like a really fun way of showing this is going to be in the city at some stage. Not just for these virtual people, but it's a way of showcasing it to you guys. It's kind of fun. Great suggestion, Jay. With the expo now officially open, it was time to take a little look at the way that people were making their way to the gates. Something that really surprised me is usually when you have these big events, you have a lot of people driving. However, when looking at the streets weren't that congested. Yeah, we did have quite a lot of red on these main roads, and that wasn't really that unusual for Sunset City. There's quite a lot of traffic anyway. However, if you were to look on the sidewalks, then that would tell a completely different story. A lot of people are choosing to walk to the event. Now, that is pretty typical for an event like this. A lot of people do choose to walk because we are relying mostly on tourists to come to these events. That means that people are usually using public transport. However, Sunset City is quite unique because the only outside connections are connected via our rail and our cruise terminal. That means that no tourists are going to be driving to our expo. Only locals, but even locals are choosing to walk. That's great, I love to see that. However, I would also like to see people using public transport. You know where this is going, don't you? A lot of people were suggesting that the Monorail network in Sunset City could have been built at the same time as the expo. A lot of cities do this when they have their exposition. They also introduce some sort of public transport that also continues to operate within the city. It's like this boost of infrastructure within the city, and I think that's a great idea. I think that's a great reason why this is here in the first place. So connecting it up was going to be pretty straightforward, until of course it wasn't. As all things go, this was not going to work because the station of the monorail is far too large for our exposition. We needed something way smaller. And in fact, this was always going to be a problem because our monorail is actually quite a small monorail. This is actually based on the Sydney monorail. It is rocking a custom skin, all thanks to Blue Thunder, but it's a small monorail. You know, a lot of monorails are small. The monorail stations and monorails in City Skylines Vanilla are massive. So what were we going to do about this? Well, you know what we're going to do. We're going to build a custom monorail station. To build this thing, I needed to find a space on the map that was just a nice little flat place where I could build this custom station. Now, as you can tell, this episode is blown out of proportion. This is really like 3 episodes squeezed into one, but I really felt like I needed to do all this within one single episode, which is why, yeah, it's a pretty dense one. Not to mention that I thought that making this custom station was going to be fairly straightforward and fairly easy. It actually turned out to be probably one of the most challenging things of this entire episode. I wanted to base these on the Sydney monorail stations. These are fairly small and only in one direction, which means that they're only on one single rail. However, in City Skylines, when it comes to making a custom one, you can only build them on doubles. So, in order to make this work, I was gonna have to get pretty creative. This is me getting creative. I'm using no controller to squish these 2 rails together to pretty much make a single one. At this stage, it was not looking very good. I did not have high hopes for this, but I was really keen to make this work. I've been struggling with the monorails in City Skylines for far too long. I've always wanted to make a station like this, and I've never seen anything really done before, so I was just so keen to make this work. Really trying as best as I could to squeeze these nodes as close as possible, even splicing in another just single rail just to hopefully hide some of the imperfections, and just testing it out, seeing if we did see in fact a monorail stopping at this invisible stop, which, as you can see, actually kind of worked to my surprise. It was a little bit janky, and we definitely smoothed things over a little later on, but for now it's looking alright. It was now just time to get in and actually make this thing look like a station. The first thing that needed to be done was to get a platform and align it up to the monorail. I wanted it to be pretty much the same size of the monorail. If I was to make a custom train station, then the platform, I'd like it to be fairly long, you know, longer than the train. Whereas for a monorail, I need this thing to be really compact. I'm not going to make a monorail any larger than this, and monorails, you want them to be fairly compact to get around the downtown nice and easy, to go around the expo. It's also not exactly a high capacity vehicle, so keeping it fairly small makes a lot of sense. Relying a lot on the procedural objects mod to manipulate a lot of these props so that they just fit the idea that I had. You know, I wanted it to have these glass panels that allowed you to see the inside of the station and the monorail coming in to collect all the passengers, then to switch out the rooftop for this more arched one, because I really love that curvy nature of the stations from Sydney. You know, this network doesn't exist anymore, but I have very fond memories of the just couple of times that I rode that network around the Sydney, around Darling Harbour, and around the downtown. So much fun, but alas, it no longer exists. I mean, it probably was a real waste of money, to be honest. I don't think very many people rode it, but it's kind of nice to build something based on it in City Skylines. I always like doing this sort of stuff, where you build something based on something that doesn't exist anymore, particularly when you've got fond memories of it, or even just experience riding it, or something that you've always wanted to experience. It's always fun. But as you can see, there is a lot of swapping out shapes and changing things with procedural objects. It was a bit of a process, but I honestly really enjoyed making this custom station, and I'm actually going to use this station throughout all of the downtown of Sunset City. I'm going to swap out those other ones, but for now, it's just going to exist within our expo. To finish it off, I added in this railing around the platform, but then it wasn't until I added in the lift. I mean, this turned out super nice, definitely a great addition. And then with it all finished and done, it was as simple as copying it over and finding the best spot to place it within the expo. I figured the grand entrance, well, this is how most people are going to be getting to the exposition, so right at the front here is the perfect spot. But then I also wanted there to be a few more stations within the exposition, so finding a couple of other spots so that it was nice and spaced out, but then also thinking about just making it easy for people to access, and also just making it look kind of cool in different areas. So this is probably one of the furthest spots you're going to be able to catch the monorail to, and then another one on the water edge, which is not worked on at the moment, but I am leaving it for the next episode. As you can see, it's all marshy at the moment, which I still kind of like. I like that it's something that we chip away at over the next few weeks. But for now, the monorail stations, it's just 3 within the exposition. Probably all we really need, but I am also leaning towards having one at Fab Arena so that we are getting people to go on the outside of the exposition. I do like the idea that you can jump on a monorail from downtown Sunset City and basically go all the way into the expo, even bypassing the grand entrance, which is a bit of a problem because it means that people can technically just jump on a monorail and then end up in the expo without buying a ticket. That's a problem with City Skylines, you know, the way that I'm gonna make money in the game, but then also the expo within the fictional way this works. And I've got a bit of a solution that I'm going to show you very shortly. But in terms of the fictional version, I like to imagine, maybe this doesn't work, but you let me know. But I like to imagine that when you buy a special ticket, then that also means that it's also admission to the exposition, but then it's also like a free trip on the monorail. You know, maybe the monorail is like a free service just for the expo, and then later down the track, it's going to cost a bit of money. Maybe that's how it works. But I did try to get this thing working just within the grounds of the expo, but for some reason, it just was not working. I wasn't seeing any monorail spawning. And at this point, I was getting a little bit nervous because I just spent a lot of time working on this monorail, particularly the station. How was this not working? I couldn't figure it out. And I definitely needed it at this stage because we had quite a lot of people trying to get into the expo. So we needed some sort of alternative. How could we get this working? Well, as it turns out, if you build a custom station like I did, you do need to connect it up to a real station. You know, a station that is a building, not just a network. And by doing that, eventually you do get a vehicle spawning. However, people still weren't using the stations. That's because I'm a big dummy and didn't make any pathway connecting up the station to the platform. So what I had to do was I had to get an invisible path and make sure it was all connected up to the platform so that people were actually going to be able to use it. So as you can imagine, when I saw that one person standing on the platform of my station, man, I felt so happy and so relieved because at this stage I didn't even know if people were going to be able to use it. So this was a massive relief. And with my custom stations now working, it was time to connect it up to the main line and see the expo line really come alive. I was really liking the fact that this monorail line was going right past the bay and right past these hotels, which I think is going to be a really great access and provide maybe a great opportunity to also have some more stations along this area, and also maybe a ferry terminal. I think that'll work really nicely, and maybe something else, but we'll think about that a little bit later on. I think we're going to need to really mess around a bit more with the way that public transport connects up to our expo. Trust me, I think we're going to really need that. And as you can imagine, I was so stoked to see all these people using our monorail station. It just meant that it was finally working, people were using the stairs. It was great, except for one thing. People were completely bypassing the entrance, which means if you are catching the monorail into the expo, you're not paying entry fee. I couldn't have this. So how are we going to fix this? Well, it's actually really simple. I simply just connected up a side entry into our amusement park onto the same path that led up to the station. Yeah, that was it. It was so simple and it worked like a treat. It meant that we were charging people entry using the monorail network. And that was just so sweet, man. Now, did it fix our money woes? No, we're bleeding money at this stage. Unfortunately, the Sunset City World Exposition has not gotten off to a good start. Not only have we not covered the costs, but sustaining it is, at the moment, not going to be financially doable. The city has also failed to deliver a complete World Exposition. There's still many areas of the place undeveloped. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to try and save our World Exposition. How we're going to do that? Well, you're just gonna have to wait for the next episode. Thank you guys so much for watching today's episode of Sunset City. So it's taken so long to get together. I know it's been a couple of weeks since I've released a video. I am busy. I am really busy at the moment. I just want to be making videos, but it's not really happening. Sorry about that. There's gonna be a few more in the works coming out pretty soon as well. So yeah, look forward to that. But yeah, I do apologize. I just want to be making videos, man. I really do. But yeah, sometimes life happens. But I do promise that there are some really exciting things coming up really soon. A big shout out to Danny Switzer, Robert Williams, Tomatin Saft, Valeria, Keith Hoffman, Shay Stanton, Costa Lucen, Electric Bill, CJ Newton, John, Fluffy the Cat, Megalodon, Emil, and Tyler Smith. Thank you, legends, for your support over on Patreon. And thank you all so much for watching. Big old thanks, and I'll catch you all in the next one.